Alright, in this video it's time to put together the actual input handling class for the Rock Band 2 controller. Now the idea of this class is it's going to function in the same respect as our keyboard input class and as our gamepad input class. Of course, the idea of these classes is simply to have a series of pad states or input states and a series of events that they fire back out whenever a specific input occurs. So the idea is that it's within this class that we look for raw input inside of an update method, then we use a current and last state check to see if a button was just pressed or just released, and then fire off the appropriate event.
Okay.
Now, the thing about these classes is the fact that they are specific to the type that they handle. What I mean by that is, in the case of the gamepad, everything is done with things like gamepad state, and it's returning a specific input type of the button's enumeration. We need this kind of input handling class built for the drum rocker or the Rock Band 2 input. So that is exactly what we're going to build. Here inside of input, we're going to add a new class, and we're going to call this class DrumInput. And we can do our basic cleanup, pull out the sub namespace, and then for our using statements, I'm simply going to steal the using statements currently inside of gamepad input. Now, just like we had to do before in our other input classes, we need a delegate to define exactly how our events are going to work and what types of parameters need to get carried along with these calls. So we're going to make a delegate dedicated to drum button hits. We're going to call this drum button notice. So I'll make a delegate with a void return type called drum button notice. And the method signature for this delegate is going to consist of three things. Again, looking back to gamepad input, when we assembled the original button notice, we had the specific button that was hit, the overall gamepad state that that button came from, again, just as if we wanted to see what other buttons might have been pressed, and finally the player index who triggered the button press. We want to have all of the same things carried along inside of our drum input. So that will begin with a drum buttons parameter called button, a drum state parameter called drum state, and finally a player index parameter called player index. Alright, with our delegate in place, we can now turn our attention to the drum input class itself. Now the input class is going to be static, so make sure we mark the class as static, and then we're ready to jump into the class's fields. We're going to begin with the last state array. Again, just like any other Xbox controller, we can have up to 4 of the controllers hooked at any given time. So just like we did in gamepad input, we're going to need to make an array of states, and we'll call these our last states.
Okay.
So we'll make a static field. It'll be of type drum state array. We're going to call this field last drum states, and I'll set it to be equal to a new drum state array with 4 elements. Alright, one other thing we need is to have a list of all of the buttons that are currently bound with this type of controller. So we'll put together a list called bound buttons. So we'll have a static list of type drum button, or rather drum buttons. We'll call this bound buttons, and we'll turn around and create it with a field initializer. So new list of type drum buttons. Alright, that takes care of the things we need to remember as time progresses inside of our drum input class. Now we need the fields to describe the events that we're going to be able to fire. So we're going to have 2 events, one called button press, one called button release. So we'll put these down as public static events, public static event. The first one is going to be of type drum button notice. So here we're putting our delegate into action, and we're going to call this event button press. Then, as we had done before in earlier videos, we're going to actually set up our event, our delegate, to have an actual anonymous method held in it, just so that we can fire it off at will without having to worry about whether or not it's been assigned. So that means drum button press will be equal to delegate, where we will construct an anonymous method with the correct method signature. And just to save a bit of time, since this method signature obviously needs to match the signature of our delegate, I'm simply going to copy all of the parameters we're currently plugging into a drum button notice and paste them into our anonymous method.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we can finish off the parentheses and then put together a set of empty brackets. So we have an empty method body for our anonymous method, so nothing actually happens. We just now have the ability to fire off button press at will. Now with button press declared, we can copy it and duplicate it. So we'll make a second public static event of type drum button notice, which we will call drum button release. And this is once again going to be set to an empty anonymous method. So that should take care of all of our fields, now that we have our events set up. Excuse me. Now we need a method that will allow us to add buttons to the bound buttons watch list. Excuse me. So to put this together, we're going to make a public static method, void return type, called add button. An add button will need to take in a specific drum input, so we'll take in a parameter of type drum buttons called button. Then inside of this method, all we're going to do is make sure that the button doesn't already exist in the bound buttons list, and then add it. So we say if not bound buttons dot contains the incoming button parameter, then we are free to proceed and take bound buttons and add in the incoming button. Alright, so that takes care of add button. Now the last method we need to address inside of DrumInput is the update method. So we get the gamepad state, look through buttons, do some sort of magic with drum states. We can actually look at drum buttons instead of gamepad buttons. So this is the main key area, or other than the obvious type differences, that we'll be working with in DrumInput as opposed to gamepad input. But we'll begin by putting the method together. That is public static void update. Update needs to take in a specific player index, the player that we are looking at in this run of update. So we drop in a player index parameter called player index. So now, inside of our method, once again, the entire drum state input decoding system is going to be based off of a gamepad state. So before we can proceed with any kind of input, we need to get a gamepad state for the current player. We'll do that by creating a local variable of type gamepad state. We'll call this pad state, and this will be equal to the gamepad dot get state for the given player index. So we'll drop in the player index parameter. So now that we've got a gamepad state, we can turn around and initialize a drum state. So immediately we're going to turn around and make a drum state variable. So we'll call this drum state, and that will be equal to a new drum state struct. And of course the struct can take in a gamepad state that will base all of its information from. Now we've just assembled a pad state variable. We'll pass that in here to the drum state constructor. So that should result in a drum state that has based all of its data off of the given pad state.
Okay.
Now that we have a drum state, everything else should be fairly standard fare. We just ask that drum state if any of the buttons of interest happen to be pressed or released. So we need to look through all the buttons currently bound. So we put together a for loop using the index variable I, and looping until we hit the end of bound buttons dot count. So here inside of our loop, we're going to first, just for convenience sake, make a local drum buttons variable. We'll call this button. And we'll just copy the value out of bound buttons sub I. So running through each iteration of the loop, the first one we want to do is check and see if that button has just been pressed. So we'll do a check, putting together a check. Now we get to use our brand new drum state and some of its methods. So we say if drum state.is button down. Now we can talk about everything in terms of drum buttons. So we say if is button down, now remember we already have that stored in the variable, so all we'll put in place here is the button variable. So if the given button happens to have just been pressed, and on the last update it was not pressed, so and last drum states sub player index dot is button up. Then we pass in the button of interest, currently in the button variable, and then close off the call to is button up, close off the call to the if statement, and we can go ahead and also block in, actually we're not going to block anything on this one, it's only one line, one statement for the if statement, and that is going to be to fire off the button press event. Button press takes in three things: a drum button, currently held in the button variable, the drum state, which is currently held in the drum state variable, and the player index, where we will pass in the player index field. Now we do have one syntax error so far, and that is the fact that player index was passed in as its enum type. We need to address an element inside of the array last drum states, so we'll cast this value in the player index over to an int before addressing it. And everything else seems to be looking a-okay on syntax. So let's copy that if statement and duplicate it so that we can do the check necessary for button release. And in button release, what we're looking for is the fact that the current drum state will do a check for is button up, and on the last button state, we'll do a check for is button down. So state just went from down to up, therefore it has been released, so we'll fire off the button release event. So again, all of this should look very familiar if we take a quick review over here into our gamepad input, where we're doing similar fields, last states, add button, an update method, things like doing the checks to see if the necessary button press or button release end up getting fired off. So all very standard stuff as far as our input system is concerned. But again, this is just doing a few changes, all of the various types required for the drum input, and then that one little lookup where we go over from the world of gamepad state over to the world of drum state, thereby making all the buttons much easier to load and send out. The other nice thing is this means all of the complicated stuff as far as decoding is concerned is all up to drum state. So everything complicated is going to be drum state's responsibility. Now with this class, if we can very briefly build, just make sure that everything gets saved out and that there are no syntax errors. Now at this point we still have some linkage that has to take place to get the drum input class fully into action.
Right.
We also need to take a look at input binding to get it in action, so we're going to save that for the upcoming video. So with that, that's going to wrap up this video.
Okay.